All right, in this video, we're going to talk about design thinking, what it is, and really why it's important to us as entrepreneurs. So we're going to start by just explaining kind of the basics surrounding design thinking. It is a process that we use to try to solve problems. And if you are an entrepreneur or aspiring to be an entrepreneur, you realize that this is a very fundamental question that before we can get into commercialization and value creation, we really need to start with an understanding of a problem that we can potentially develop a solution for. So this is where design thinking can help us with a framework to understanding our customers and to gathering information and to ultimately creating products that people enjoy. So the starting point for design thinking is the pillars. Now, design thinking is based upon three fundamental pillars, the first of which is empathy. And empathy, of course, is understanding, in our case, our customers, which is very, very crucial. And so you see, as we go through the design thinking process, empathy is something that plays a very, very critical role. The next critical piece to design thinking is what we call ideation. Now, ideation sounds like a really creative and interesting term, but really all it is to embody this process of coming up with ideas, coming up with ways that we can potentially solve people's problems. Notice, though, that we start first with empathy because it's really difficult for us to solve a problem for someone who we haven't walked in their shoes. And so this piece is very, very important. After ideation, the next pillar is experimentation. And experimentation is a very critical piece to entrepreneurship. There's been a huge wave through entrepreneurship to kind of more of this testing lean methodology that was pioneered by Eric Ries, who wrote Lean Startup several years ago. And it is very much permeated through not only Silicon Valley, but other pockets as well, and has kind of created this mindset that entrepreneurs are really like scientists in a lab, but instead of working in an official laboratory with beakers and a bunch of different chemicals, our laboratory is the real world. And the better that we can run tests and gather information and refine our ideas, more times that we can do that, the better off that we are in terms of releasing a product that people are going to enjoy versus making a lot of assumptions, releasing something into the market and trying to, hopefully kind of taking the wait and see approach to hopefully that feedback will be favorable to us. So this is the basic framework for design thinking, right? Injecting empathy into the things that we do, engaging in this process of ideation, coming up with ideas, and then of course experimentation, right? Because nobody comes up with an idea that is going to be commercially viable day one, right? A lot of times we start with an idea, and as we communicate with customers, that idea changes, right? Our understanding of our customers change, the problem, or at least our understanding of it, changes, and that of course changes the features and the benefits that we seek to provide, which is really important. So now we're going to go into kind of this design thinking process. It very much is dependent upon these pillars, but there's a couple of extra steps that we're going to talk through just to give you some clarity over what are the things that we should be thinking about as we get to a place to where we're interacting with customers and trying to get feedback. So the first thing shouldn't come as a surprise. The first section is what we call empathize. This is the first step to the design thinking process. And this takes many, many forms. One of the things that we talk about a lot is what we call customer discovery. So if you haven't read or heard a whole lot of customer discovery, I encourage you to do a little bit of research on the topic. Essentially, customer discovery is about getting out of the building and talking with customers about our ideas and about their problems, not necessarily trying to pitch our ideas to get them to purchase something, but just really trying to understand our customers and their current positions and their frustrations and problems and different things so that we can develop better solutions for them and solutions that ultimately will resonate with them. So the empathy part is really, really important. Another tool that we use along with the customer discovery and gathering information is what we call a customer empathy map. And that is a very simple tool. You can actually find it online. And it's meant as a visual aid to help map out or sketch your understanding of your customer in some very specific areas. And so it's meant to be sort of this kind of ongoing kind of piece of work. As you interact with customers and learn more, you're updating your map, which essentially is a visual representation of your customers. And so you have this clear image of who you're actually building a product or service for, which helps you develop the features in a different way versus if you're focusing on a general age range, like a 25 to 44-year-old, which is very broad, and it's very difficult to design a product for such a broad user base, at least at the beginning. Now, once we've engaged in this process of empathy through engaging in customer discovery and putting together our customer empathy map and customer profiles, then we're going to move on to the next stage, which is what we call define. And in the define stage, this is where we actually get to the point where we're actually identifying what are the problems. A lot of times when we come into trying to start a business, we have an idea or at least a belief about what the problems are. But once we start with kind of this customer empathy piece and interacting with customers, we realize that the problems are vastly different than what we thought. And so we have to make changes. And so this helps us to kind of solidify what are the problems, what are we going to try to solve, and what are we going to build. The next stage, which is stage 3, is ideate. Under the ideate stage, we're actually going to try to develop solutions to the problems that we identified before. And so this is where we finally get to a place to where we're thinking of an actual solution. Now, this intuitively probably makes sense, but if you think about the way that people normally try to solve problems, right? We don't necessarily engage in empathy. We don't necessarily define problems. A lot of times when we're thinking of a business to start, we start in this stage right here, right? We start with solutions. And then we work backwards, and then we try to go and see if there's a problem that we can solve with them. And so with the design thinking process, we're actually reversing the order. We're not coming in with an existing solution and trying to find a market for that solution. We're looking at the market and we're trying to see what are the problems, the frustrations, and the hangups that the people in the market have, and how can I develop a solution that is tailor-made to that group. So it's a little bit of a different process than what we commonly see and what people usually engage in, is that we are looking for problems and then we are trying to develop solutions for those. Now, the next stage to this process, and this is very much in line with the pillars in design thinking, is we're going to develop a prototype. Now, when many people see the word prototype, they assume that I'm referring to some kind of physical representation of a product, and that is certainly an option. But by prototype, I'm generally referring to the term a minimum viable product. And so a minimum viable product is a term that was coined by Eric Ries in Lean Startup. And it's essentially the lowest form of the product that people will accept that allows you to get feedback on some of your key assumptions. So instead of operating, if you want to start a restaurant, instead of launching a restaurant, maybe your MVP is cooking up some food and doing sampling and having a questionnaire and getting feedback. So that's a way for you to determine if people actually like your food without the investment of buying or renting a place and putting in a commercial kitchen and going through all the different health inspection regulations that you have to do. You want to kind of have a staggered approach, right? And ultimately escalate your commitment as it makes sense, not go, in essence, all in, and then magnify your risk. Instead, you want little checkpoints, little mile markers. And when you pass one, that gives you permission to go on to the next one and scale up your commitment just a little bit more in terms of time and money. And so we're doing this in a very practical and conservative way so that we can see what the market is pulling versus trying to push products into the market and trying to convince consumers to buy them, which may work, but we will need a lot of advertising and marketing money to be able to push products into market. And for the lion's share of entrepreneurs, this simply isn't a viable option for obvious reasons. So prototyping is a very key, important part of this design thinking process. Now, the last part to the whole puzzle is testing. And in testing, what we're doing is we're using our prototypes or minimum viable products that we develop to actually get feedback, right? So we're making a list of all of the assumptions we have, and we're trying to get feedback from the market to see if our assumptions are true and if we need to make any kind of changes. And this is a very important part to this process because what we don't want is to release a product into the market and that'd be the first time that customers are interacting with that, right? That might go well, but it can also go very poorly, and we might have invested a lot of money and time into that process. So by going through this design thinking process, we can very much ramp up the feedback cycle that we get by going from empathy to defining, to ideation, to prototyping, and then lastly to testing. And then we can engage in this iterative process where we're continuing through the cycle multiple times, and as a result, refining our products and making them better and better and better. But that's a little about the design thinking process. So again, it is very much kind of a process that we want to, as we're thinking about launching products, we want to mentally think about how do we display empathy, and how do we gather information, and how do we define the problems, and how do we ideate, and how do we prototype, and how do we test. And by doing this process, we can essentially get to a point to where we are gathering and having a better understanding of our customer, but also producing products that ultimately lead to the fulfillment of some kind of legitimate customer problem.